We'll get started in just a minute. We'll give folks a few seconds to join us. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Amy Blythe, and I'd like to welcome you to Environmental Compliance and Considerations, Environmental Compliance Considerations for Linear Infrastructure Projects. Our speakers today will provide a clear, applied overview of environmental compliance considerations that affect routing, design, permitting, and construction for linear infrastructure projects. We're excited to get started, but I'd like to share a few housekeeping items before we do that. First of all attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have questions during any point today, our time together, please use the questions panel in your Teams menu. We will save a few minutes at the end of our discussion today for Q&A with our presenters. And if we don't get to your questions today during our time together, we'd be happy to follow up with an email. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a copy of that recording in your email inbox after today's event. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Margaret Caligaris is an environmental consultant specializing in environmental permitting and resource management. She supports CEQA, NEPA, and Clean Water Act compliance for linear utility projects across the U.S. Second, we have Jameson Honeycutt. He is an environmental planner with 15 years of experience in natural resources management, land use planning, and regulatory permitting. He specializes in CEQA and NEPA environmental analysis and provides regulatory oversight for infrastructure, land reuse, and remediation projects. With that, I'll kick us off today, passing it over to Jameson.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining. Amy, are we gonna move to our next slide? Great, thank you. So today we're going to focus on how environmental compliance actually plays out on linear infrastructure projects, and more importantly, how to get ahead of it. Our goal here is to help project managers and engineers identify regulatory triggers early, understand how planning and design decisions affect permitting, and ultimately reduce risk, schedule impacts, and scope creep. Linear infrastructure projects, whether they be utilities, pipelines, transportation, or broadband, almost always intersect with environmental regulations. The challenge isn't that the rules are unpredictable, it's that the impacts, timelines, and permitting scope are often underestimated early. So today we're going to walk through what actually triggers environmental review on linear projects, how early screening and due diligence changes outcomes, where you can possibly streamline through exemptions, exclusions, and general permits, and how routing and construction methods directly influence permitting. And we'll close with a few lessons learned, what consistently works and what tends to create problems. With that, I'll hand it over to Margaret to start us with a quick overview of linear infrastructure projects.
Great. Thanks, Jameson, and thanks everybody for joining. First, we need to answer the question, well, what actually is linear infrastructure? Linear infrastructure projects are those that span over distance and are usually long, continuous developments that connect resources or locations. So your roads, utility lines, pipelines, etc. They could span a few hundred feet or a few hundred miles, remain contained within one city, or cross multiple cities, counties, even states. Commonly installed across corridors or along corridors, they may cross a variety of land uses like agriculture, forests, developed open space, industrial, and may involve multiple agencies, landowners, and other stakeholders. Traditional projects, comparatively, are generally characterized by a contained work area in a single location. These are generally your residential developments or improvement projects, remedial actions, restoration activities in some instances. Linear infrastructure, due to the dynamic and often complex nature of the design associated with projects of this size, have the potential to require complex permitting and longer-term agency coordination. With these large-scale projects, an understanding of the regulatory process and environmental compliance requirements is key early on to reduce potential impacts to project schedule and budget. Next slide, please, Amy. Why planning for environmental compliance matters. Geographic scale of linear infrastructure projects increases complexity in regulatory navigation and permitting. Sometimes with the scale of these projects, it can be difficult to identify what is needed and when and where to start. Projects may overlap multiple jurisdictions, sometimes even different divisions within the same agency, and may require coordination with more regulatory authorities and agents than originally expected. I've had projects permitting through one overarching agency, but because this singular project crossed different districts or divisions within that agency, this project team had to individually permit through each district, even as one continuous linear project. Impacts that may be small at a single location may cumulatively be much greater, triggering a compliance action not already planned for. For instance, with waters of the United States, sometimes construction of a singular tower proximate to or close to a water body may not disturb as much ground as the U.S. Army Corps may require in order to go through a really complex and robust permitting process. But if you're constructing multiple towers within a larger region across multiple water bodies, then the ground disturbance of the project in total may trigger an accumulation of ground disturbance above the threshold, thereby requiring additional action and permitting through the agency. We see this in California also with long linear utility projects that have a very small ground disturbance acreage, assuming that they will not need a coverage under the construction general permit for stormwater discharges, since a project has to disturb an acre or more of land in order to trigger this compliance action. But across miles, hundreds of miles, that smaller footprint is really expanded to meet that threshold and therefore require compliance under that general permit. Early planning increases routing flexibility when feasible and can lead to conscientious engineering choices that can reduce impacts across the project. Refraining from planning for these compliance requirements could lead to lengthy delays and extra costs for your project. Next slide, please, Amy. But when is environmental review and permitting really required? How do we know if our project is going to trigger lengthy agency reviews or require expensive permits? The simple answer is that linear projects almost always require some level of review. Depending on span, location, and project funding, a variety of federal, state, and local permits may apply. Ultimately, the level of review will depend upon the presence of resources and construction and operational approach. Jameson will talk more on the construction and operational approach later in this presentation, but we have other strategies, including desktop reviews. Jameson will also touch on those later. Field technical studies to identify resources, engagement with consultants or regulators familiar with the proposed project area, who may have a greater understanding of what is required, when, and who should be contacted to obtain these authorizations. Next slide, please, Amy. As an example of common regulations and permits that linear projects should be aware of, we've pulled together this list. This is in no way a catch-all, but the big, long timeline permits and resources to be aware of are generally surrounding water resources, land use and easements, threatened species and biological resources, and cultural resources. For the federal, we generally see a lot of compliance actions related to the Clean Water Act, Section 404, and the subsequent nationwide permits when they apply for crossings, for impacts within the ordinary high water mark, and for other impacts that your project may have to waters of the United States. We also see a lot of compliance activities under the Endangered Species Act, Section 7 and Section 10, the National Historic Preservation Act, federal rights of way. At the state level, there's a lot around water quality certifications, isolated wetlands. In instances where historically wetlands have not been protected because they do not meet the definition as a water of the United States, we see that a lot of states are coming in with their own isolated wetland permitting requirements, and those generally have quite a robust permitting process. There's also the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System program, which on the state level can generally be construction general permitting for stormwater discharges, outfall relocates or location permits, and then industrial stormwater discharges. For local, we have grading, building, land use permits, floodplain development permits, encroachment and right-of-way permitting, and air pollution and emissions permits. Each of these will have their own application and technical requirements, and for federal authorizations, often include an additional environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act, also commonly referred to as NEPA. Next slide, please. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, sets the framework for federal agencies engaging in discretionary actions to assess how a particular project will impact the surrounding natural and human or social environment. A review under NEPA is required for projects where a federal agency takes a discretionary action. Commonly, those include approval of an easement or construction on federal land, award of a grant or other funding to particular projects under an established program or independently, and issuance of permits for impacts to federally regulated resources. On this slide, we have an example of all of the different lead agencies that we as Trihydro have coordinated with for projects to verify compliance under NEPA. No federal discretionary action, there's no NEPA trigger. However, this doesn't preclude environmental review requirements at the state level, for example, the California Environmental Quality Act. For projects that cannot avoid triggering a NEPA review, it's important to remember that this process is procedural and not prohibitive. And while it may extend authorization timelines, it is not in of itself a project ender. There are different levels of environmental review under NEPA. And while we won't go into a lot of detail about them today, they vary in timeline and public engagement requirements. There are 3 levels of NEPA review, what we refer to as categorical exclusions, environmental assessments, and environmental impact statements. Categorical exclusions are generally for projects that the lead agency, once the lead agency has been established, has verified will have minimal impact to the natural and human environment. And so they develop an environmental report. This process does not require any public engagement prior to project continuation. The environmental assessments are the second step up in environmental analysis. They have page limits, public engagement requirements, and are followed by an eventual issuance of a finding of no significant impact, or a FONSI. The environmental impact statements are probably the most robust environmental review on the federal level that we see. They're much larger documents, they require a lot more lead time, they analyze a lot more resource areas with a lot more scrutiny. They have a longer public review window and a 30-day wait period after the final document is completed before the agency can issue a record of decision and the project can continue on. Working with agencies early and determining whether NEPA is a consideration for your project and what level of environmental review you can anticipate will assist with a successful project completion. But how can we identify this ahead of time? Next slide, please, Amy. To prepare for potential regulatory and environmental compliance requirements, we recommend conducting what we are referring to as environmental due diligence as a best practice. Implementing this strategy at project inception or initial design can assist project teams with identifying sensitive resources that may require additional technical study or permitting that may affect anticipated timeline. Implementing early increases project flexibility and can help teams avoid or plan for potential future roadblocks that could make or break a project. Planning for certain authorizations that we know will require additional technical reporting, for instance, federal permitting that requires compliance under the National Historic Preservation Act will require at least a Phase 1 cultural assessment. Water-related permitting often requires field verification, either in the form of a delineation or a waters assessment. And initial database review can identify whether a project in critical habitat will require biologist field verification. Each of these studies require additional time to complete and prepare, and sometimes, especially in the instance of the biological assessments, they need to occur within a certain time frame of the year. These must be completed in a lot of instances before some agencies will even accept an initial application. For projects that require federal discretionary action, remember that's federal funding, land ownership, or permitting, the project team can also anticipate public engagement requirements under NEPA. Next slide, please. Due diligence strategies include utilizing publicly available data to perform an initial screen of resources that may be present and affected by the project. This is not a catch-all approach. What's available on a public database may still require field verification, but it's a great start. These databases can help teams identify sensitive resources, biospecies that require extra survey, waterways, wells, fault lines, unstable soils that may require extra planning or avoidance. Project teams can also identify and visualize how the proposed project or routing intersects local, state, and federal boundaries that could be an indicator of agency jurisdictional change to allow for budgeting time and money for agency engagement activities. Some of these public databases have downloadable data that your GIS teams or engineering teams can utilize to in real time see how your anticipated project footprint intersects each of these areas. The public resources can also identify community stakeholders that may trigger a need for public outreach on your project. Maybe there are groups that have historically not been supportive of new ground disturbing activities, or different landowners that, even if you're constructing within a right of way, your project will impact. Identifying these stakeholders allows project teams to determine their ideal approach to implementation, whether that be by engaging the public in instances where maybe you don't need to, or in figuring out appropriate notification protocols for construction. Next slide, please, Amy. Implementing environmental due diligence early can assist projects with streamlining the agency authorization process by anticipating what is needed or triggered, developing an adaptive project approach, and facilitating collaborative relationship building with agencies and key stakeholders. The great thing about due diligence as we're presenting it is that it's transferable from project to project. Once this is an established part of your project development routine, we can reduce the amount of surprises that a project may experience. Something common that successful projects I've assisted with have completed was an initial permitting screen, what we call a permitting matrix, that identifies, even before project planning is completed, the triggers for each permit, what permits are anticipated, who the agency point of contact may be, and the anticipated time frame for permit or authorization acquisition. Having this physical, concise reference guide is incredibly helpful through the planning stage of the project. Now I'll pass it along to Jameson to provide some insight on screening tools, permitting avenues for linear projects, and some lessons learned.
Great. Thank you, Margaret. Well, let's focus our attention on what type of tools are available for linear projects. Fortunately, there's a lot of online screening tools, many using a GIS platform that give you corridor level visibility early before routing, design, and construction approaches are set. One of the most common ones is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wetland Inventory, or NWI. This is an extremely helpful tool in helping flag potential wetland crossings or waters early, so routing and construction choices don't unintentionally trigger more complex permitting, such as Clean Water Act 404 review. Another common one is special status species databases. At a federal level, there's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service IPAC, or Information Planning and Consultation Tool, as well as at the local level. At states have databases like the California Natural Diversity Database. These databases help identify potential biological constraints early, critical habitat areas, or potential corridors, ultimately supporting smarter routing, seasonal planning, and survey schedules. Most states or counties also have natural resource departments that have species lists available, often with GIS query tools. Most municipalities also have an online land use portal that provides context for the various jurisdictions, potential stakeholders in the area, identified land uses or land use restrictions, which are very informative for permitting and access. USGS National Hydrography Dataset Tool improves visibility into stream networks and drainage patterns, helping teams identify stream crossings. FEMA has a floodplain mapping tool for floodplain crossings and hazard areas, which ultimately supports permit planning, construction, and timing decisions. The National Wild and Scenic River System identifies river designations and higher sensitivity crossings that may require additional coordination or avoidance. Many state and local databases can identify public supply wells, private wells, and aquifers along your corridor. And then the USGS fault maps inform constructability and risk by identifying areas of unstable ground or seismic sensitivity that may affect design and permitting. The USDA also has a web soil survey which details descriptions of your soils within your area. So the key point here really is that these tools don't replace field work or agency coordination, but they do give you clear visibility early into what makes your project routing and design and decisions a little bit more effective before committing to one design or another. Next slide. So once you've identified potential constraints, the next step may be, can your project qualify for some form of a streamlined review? These pathways don't always eliminate review, but when impacts are low and well planned, they can significantly reduce timelines and complexity. A few of the most common ones that we see on linear projects include the Nationwide Permit Program under the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. For linear projects that affect waters of the U.S. or wetlands, this is one of the first places to look. If impacts can stay below certain thresholds and construction methods minimize disturbance, you can often qualify for a nationwide instead of an individual permit, which is typically faster and much more predictable. Common examples of these permits are for projects that are utility line activities, maintenance, and minor discharges. For programmatic or streamlined environmental reviews, this includes things like the categorical exclusion and programmatic environmental assessments under NEPA. The idea here is consistency. If impacts are understood and repeatable, you don't need to start from scratch every time. Projects can tear off those broader reviews, which often reduce documentation and review time. Many states also have similar programs for routine activities like stream crossings, stormwater discharges, or floodplain work. These typically have defined thresholds and standard conditions, so early screening tools help you understand if you can stay within those limits. And some agencies have established processes for specifically for infrastructure crossing sensitive areas like floodplain or transportation corridors. These programs recognize that this work is necessary and they provide a more standardized path forward if impacts are managed appropriately. So the key takeaway here is that streamlining doesn't happen by accident, you design into it. And that comes back to early routing, your construction methods, and understanding your constraints up front. Next slide. So across all of these streamlined pathways, agencies are generally looking for the same core things. First, a well-defined project with a clear preferred approach. That means not just what you're proposing, but why are you proposing it? Understand your project, especially for routing and construction methods. Second, an upfront understanding of constraints. Agencies expect you to know what you're crossing, whether it be a wetland, streams, habitat, floodplains. Know this in advance. You don't want this to be discovered during your review. Third, the right level of supporting data. If studies are needed, such as biological, cultural, water, geotech, they should be completed or at least clearly scoped in advance. Having this information early builds confidence and speeds up your review. And finally, evidence of avoidance and minimization. This is a big one. For linear projects that usually come down to staying within existing corridors where possible and using lower impact construction methods. If you can hit these four things, you're much more likely to stay within a streamlined pathway. If you don't, that's when the project starts to expand in scope, time, and complexity. Next slide. So one of the biggest drivers of permitting on linear projects is construction methodology, often more than the alignment itself. Two projects can follow the same route, but have very different permitting outcomes depending on how they're built. So on the lower impact side, we have horizontal directional drilling, or HDD. This one allows you to cross waterways or sensitive areas without direct ground disturbance. When feasible, it can reduce impacts and help you keep in a more streamlined permitting pathway. A similar concept is jack and bore, which also minimizes surface disturbance, especially under roads, rail, or other features. Aerial installation on existing infrastructure limits ground disturbance and in some cases can help support the categorical exclusion or simplified review. One of the most effective ways to minimize impact is to work within existing roads or rights of way. Agencies generally view previously disturbed corridors much more favorably than disturbing new corridors. So the key takeaway on this is that construction methods aren't just engineering decisions, they ultimately are permitting decisions. And when that's considered early, it can significantly reduce permitting complexity, timeline, and overall project risk. Next slide. So I'm going to close with a few lessons learned we consistently see across our linear projects. So first, define the project clearly and identify the lead agency early. If the project scope, limits, or approach aren't well defined and the lead agency isn't clear, you're going to end up with mixed direction, rework, and unnecessary risk. Second, set realistic permitting timelines. Most delays aren't surprises. They're the result of early assumptions that don't match the actual regulatory pathway. Third, align routing, design, and construction early. Those decisions drive permitting outcomes. If they're not aligned up front, you're going to lose flexibility later. And finally, maintain continuity and agency coordination. Projects change, staff change, but if the project story isn't consistent, risks increase. So at the end of the day, all of this points to the same thing. Environmental outcomes are shaped early. When those early decisions are aligned, permitting becomes much more predictable and far less disruptive. Next slide. And I'll bring us on home with a couple key takeaways here. So regulatory triggers on linear projects aren't random. They're predictable when you can identify them early. Screening tools and early due diligence give you visibility before decisions get locked in. And routing, design, and construction methods aren't just engineering decisions, they're ultimately permitting decisions too. The consistent theme across everything we've covered today is environmental outcomes are shaped early. When those decisions are aligned up front, you gain more control over your schedule, cost, and risk, and permitting becomes much more predictable. So with that, I thank everybody for their attendance and would like to open it up to any questions.
All right. Thanks so much, Jameson and Margaret. Lots of good information there. So we have a little time for Q&A. Please type your questions in the Teams Q&A panel. If we run out of time together today, we'll follow up with an email afterwards. So I'm not seeing any questions as of yet, but please feel free to put your questions in that panel. All right, so here's a question. How do you approach projects that cross multiple jurisdictions or agencies?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this and let Margaret fill in a little bit, but again, we hit on identifying that likely lead agency early. Oftentimes, these projects do have multiple agencies, both at the federal and state level. So really identifying those points of contact, mapping out what the permitting landscape looks like. Even if the agencies have different requirements, there tends to be a fair amount of overlap. One of the tools that Margaret had mentioned that we tend to use for these type of projects are permitting matrix. That really kind of gives you a full landscape of what you're going to encounter with your permits. It can help with the sequencing, the timing. Some authorizations are predicated on other authorizations. And so again, establishing those early points of contact and mapping it out.
Yeah, and to build off that, especially in instances where a lead agency is being determined and we're still in the process of trying to understand who that might be. We have run into instances where lead agencies or agencies who, are approached as the potential lead agency really don't would prefer not to act as the lead agency and instead collaborate with others. And so understanding that early on and getting an agency uh, to take the lead agency role early on is really integral to this process.
Okay. Another question. When does it make sense to engage agencies early versus waiting until you have a defined design?
Yeah, good question, Amy. Um, More often than not, projects aren't fully designed by the time you're trying to look at some sort of environmental review or permitting, and that's perfectly acceptable. However, it is really important that you have a pretty clear concept of your project footprint. I know a lot of the specifics and the details may not be worked out, but having that concept fairly well defined is pretty important. And early coordination, again, you don't have to kick it off, but I think, waiting 3 months before you like to get constructed can be problematic. So early coordination is effective, getting agency review early on those projects to get any sort of input on any sort of constraints, things on how construction design could affect your project, will oftentimes lead to a much better project.
And also when your mapped route or anticipated route does cross or engage with or potentially impact a variety of resources. Sometimes it's more beneficial for the agency to see an initial concept rather than a defined design, because with a concept, you have a little bit more flexibility, and that inspires a little bit more confidence on the agency's side and facilitates a really generally positive collaborative environment.
Yeah, and I guess kind of to add to that, the last thing I think you want to be doing is also late in the game adding new project elements that may require subsequent review or going back to the drawing board. We've experienced that in the past, and that can significantly compromise a timeline. So understanding kind of the total area of effect or where your project's going to be and considering that early on.
Great. Okay, one more came in. What do you do if environmental constraints are identified after design is already underway?
Yeah. Yeah, this one happens quite a bit, unfortunately, and sometimes these things sneak up even under the best due diligence and planning. And unfortunately, it can result in managing the trade-offs. Are you needing to ultimately adjust your route, change your design, entertain a new construction method, or potentially consider much more complicated permitting? So obviously, the earlier you can account for that, the more options you have. Some really good examples of this that we've experienced tend to be with cultural resources within your project boundary and having to reroute around those, identifying waters or wetland crossings, or having potentially sensitive biological resources within your project area that may require either seasonal surveys or in a more extreme event may require some form of mitigation.
And for environmental due diligence, it's always easier to, review a project that has a preliminary route. For some of these incredibly long utility or linear projects, we see that the initial route is not the end all be all. It's not the hard stop. It's usually just this follows the roadway. This fulfills our, goals for this project. And there is more flexibility than, what would exist further down in the design process. For projects that, as a project planner, you would not originally anticipate there to be a lot of permitting requirements. For instance, an established linear corridor that we're really just proposing some maintenance types of activities like replacing a utility tower or abandoning some section of pipeline and replacing it with something else in a subsurface methodology. Um, because these rights of ways are usually very maintained, it's a great and flat. It's a great area for now water to pond. And so over time, we see that these rights of way are great locations for new wetlands to pop up, new riparian areas to pop up, create some really great habitat for threatened species, which then turns your maintenance project into one that requires a lot more agency coordination and potential authorizations.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more questions come in. So I guess with that, we'll give our audience a little bit of time back in their day. Just a reminder, we'll provide the recording of today's presentation via email within the next week or so. And Jameson and Margaret's information is up on the screen right now if you want to get in touch with them on specific questions. But just wanted to say thank you for joining us today, and we hope you all have a safe day.
All right. Thank you, Amy, and thank you to the audience for attending today.
Yeah, thanks everyone.